great. And if I end up having to do, well, so I haven't been talking at all. Mike Rose is with us, everybody. Mike Rose.
Hello.
TV's Mike Rose. Not really.
Not anymore.
But that's what you say. You say TV is Mike Rose, everybody. Star of film and screen, which is actually the same thing now that I think about it. Sort of stage and screen, I think is what you're
Stage
supposed
and
to say.
screen. Stage
Yeah.
and screen. Yes.
Yeah, cameras can be distracting. So last week, when Allison Sheridan was on the show, I actually did video. And we recorded it and I put it up on YouTube, and that was great. And, well, I'd say great. I don't know. People would have to decide. Look for it on YouTube. That's fine. I wasn't planning on talking about the fact that we were doing video this week either, because, of course, next week there won't be this show. People don't need to know everything that's going on in my life. But if I sound distracted, I apologize. I should never have done video. That's what I'm learning. Because it's like flashing up warnings. I got this thing in my face and it's whatever. Plus, Mike said yesterday, I'm looking at the wrong camera. Then people listening to the audio thing have to be like, why is he looking at the camera at all? Yeah, so
Just we all are nowadays. It's
that's true.
panopticon.
That's true.
Yeah.
I don't actually know if this video will be available because I don't know if this video is recording. So I definitely
It's like the bad old days where we had to wait for them to print the film
right.
before we knew what came out.
Man, do you know, by the way, how much worse that is now? So
Film?
yeah, film. I mean, maybe not where you are, because you live in one of the parts of the country I would think that would still really focus on that. Last year, somebody I know had to do a photographic shoot. Like they wanted them
Yep.
not to bring phones; they wanted them to bring like those disposable wedding cams, right? And then you get the wedding cam, then you take it back to CVS, Rite Aid, wherever, and fill
Yep.
out the thing, and then say, okay, well, call me, and they're like, okay, well, it's going to be like a month because nobody does film anymore,
Wow.
but we will call you. And then 3 months later, they were like, I never got, what happened to that? And so then they called, and they were like, yeah, I can't really look right now, but we only keep it for a month. So if your stuff came in and you didn't come in and pick it up, it's probably gone. And so
What?
and so then we went and we did find it, and turns out, yes, they did have it. Yeah, because I guess that bin would get too full of all the other video, of all the other film they're
All
not
the other film.
not developing or not telling people. Because yeah, once the film came in, they didn't call and say, hey, it's here. It was just sort of like, well, I hope they come back someday. Anyway, and then of course the other problem is the pictures are crap because you can't like check them and go, oh, now I need to shoot that again.
I mean, the number of times I've seen people younger than 20,
Hmm.
look at a film camera and say, well, where, like, how do I see it?
Right.
It's like you can't. So we were on vacation a couple weeks ago, and it was a 2-week vacation, which was lovely, and we had to do laundry in the middle of it. So I took the container of quarters we keep in the car for old timey parking meters, of
Yes.
which there are fewer and fewer in New York City, um, and I ended up with a collection of pennies and so forth, and I sent one of my daughters to the motel office with the container of quarters, or holding pennies and saying, "Go change these in for a quarter. We needed more quarters for laundry." She left the container with the office, and it was a film canister,
Oh
an
no.
empty Kodak film canister. I was like, "We're never." And I said to my wife, "I said, I'm sorry, we're never going to find that again. We'll have to come up with another plan." And she said, "I'm confident that there is a film canister in our house right now."
I was going to say, if you need any, I mean, if you actually need any, let me know. I'll call my mom because I'm pretty sure that there's still film from my high school graduation in a drawer that has not been sent.
I probably have an unexposed roll of Ilford XP1 hiding someplace, and I'm sure I've got, like, there was a time when I shot the Kodak motion picture film, and the number of it escapes me. But the advantage of both the Ilford black and white, the XP1, and the Kodak motion picture film was that you could. My recollection is you could push them, or you didn't have to push them. You could expose them from 32 ISO all the way up to 1600 within the same roll.
Hmm.
They were very flexible in terms of their light gathering capability. But Ilford XP1 was a 35 millimeter film that was black and white, but was the C41 color negative process. You send it in, you would send it to your local photomat, and they would process it like color film. And what was great is because you get free prints with that, and the prints would come back sepia tone.
I was going to say.
They were the machinery was calibrated to strip out the orange the orange safety coating on the color negative film. So when you printed black and white film that way, you got what looked like old-timey sepia tone photos for super cheap rather than having to do it yourself. It was awesome. It was a great, I highly if you got a camera and you want to shoot some fun film, go find yourself a roll of Ilford XP1, and then you can wait 3 months for Photomat or CBS to process your film.
Yeah, whichever. Hey, speaking of cameras being a distraction.
Yes.
So last week on Capitol Hill, did you watch any of that?
I was working, which is a funny thing to say because I was at home like everybody else. But I caught some of the replays. I did hear that Amazon chairman Jeff Bezos had to delay his testimony because his bandwidth was bad, which I felt was amazing.
That's kind of funny. I didn't hear that.
It's a weird phenomenon having these extremely powerful people show up on Capitol Hill or virtually show up on Capitol Hill.
Well, I found it. So here's the thing. I had thought, and I said this on last week's Mac OS Ken, because it started at, not a bad time for humans, but the problem is I stay up all night and work on Mac OS Ken. So the time that they started really just didn't work for me. And so I thought, okay, I'll go back and watch the whole thing later. But then I got up and there were still like 2 hours left. And so I watched those 2 hours. I don't need to go back and watch the beginning, I don't think, because it was Clusterthing is what I said on Mac OS Ken. Clown car would be fine. Circus, I mean, whichever. First of all, if Dave Cicilline, a representative from Rhode Island, wanted to actually call and work with somebody at Apple or talk with somebody at Apple, my guess is he would actually be able to call and talk with somebody at Apple or work with somebody at Apple. Same for Jim Jordan of Ohio. These are members of Congress. If they actually wanted to talk to big tech about what's going on in big tech and maybe form some kind of working group, I would imagine that they could make that happen. And instead, what we got theoretically was this was after a year of them, looking into what was going on at the various companies, and they get them together to yell about whatever they want to yell about. Like, why was Donald Trump Jr. removed from Facebook, Mr. Zuckerberg? You heard about that one, right?
Yeah, it was. I can't remember what he was posting, but I did.
Well, no, he wasn't posting anything. See, that was the thing, because what Zuckerberg said was, well, actually, he was removed from Twitter, but I'll try to address your concern.
Right. Oh, right.
Right.
I mean, it's what he posted on Twitter. Yes.
There was Representative Raskin was talking to Tim Cook about, and this is one of the big things that they've been upset about is payments in the App Store, right?
Right.
And so Cook was saying, look, 84% of what's in the App Store is free, and then there are also different levels for subscriptions, 30%, 15%. And he said, well, I don't understand. Why would there be two different things? And Cook was like, well, it graduates from 30% to 15%. And Raskin said, okay, so when you go into the App Store, it's free, and then it's 15, and then it goes up to 30. And it's like, this is what a year has produced. This is what a year has produced. Because, by the way, for people listening, no, that's not the way it works. I think
not how it works at all.
Probably anybody listening to this knows that. I mean, the whole thing just struck me as performative is a word that I've heard a lot lately. It struck me as performative. I joked last week with Allison Sheridan that they were all appearing before the House subcommittee on We Hate You Right Now because it benefits us politically to do so.
Yeah.
There are real concerns with tech. There are real concerns with how tech does its business. I came away feeling like absolutely none of those were addressed last week.
Yeah, I mean, I think the content moderation or the rise of extremism online is probably a lot more important to the health of the American experiment than exactly what percentage Apple charges on the App Store. Now, it's not to say that staff and other folks aren't having these conversations and there aren't things that nothing is happening in the background, but you're right that the hearing context is performative because it is done specifically for television, and not necessarily to make great policy. It's interesting that, to take one tiny corner example, and we were talking about games earlier in the week, none of the game streaming solutions that are out now, so in NVIDIA's, Google Stadia, Xbox, with the Xbox beta, whatever the thing is called, Xbox. There's a Microsoft something. Microsoft has something similar to Google Stadia that's coming along. I just can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
Right.
But all of these solutions will stream to Android devices. Will stream games. Like you can play that remote game on an Android device. You cannot do it on an iPhone or an iPad. And the reason, and Microsoft has said this on the record, the reason is because of unspecified App Store rules from Apple.
Okay.
That's an interesting, I mean, you could argue it's maybe anti-competitive in a way that's not benefiting Apple because it means that the devices become less attractive. But that's an interesting point at which Apple is potentially stifling innovation, and potentially stifling, a different way for consumers to get what they want. I don't imagine anyone talked about that. Everyone was talking about like how much Apple charges, or which service did Donald Trump Jr. get kicked off of, and are we talking to the right person about that? But for decades, Apple's behavior on the App Store has been a question of like, can you pick the monopolist out of a lineup? If we from the Apple side, or from the Apple consumer side, or from the Apple pundit side, can't look at the company and say, yeah, there's problems or there's concerns with the way this company does business, owning this delivery channel the way it does, and Congress is within its rights to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Like we should, and we are able to say that, but doesn't seem to me that that's what they were talking about. Doesn't seem to me that that's what they cared about.
Let me ask you a question. Do you see a problem with the way the App Store is run?
I see lots of problems with the way the App Store is run, but they're not all about how the way things are priced on the App Store. Some of it is about the way, the way that the 30% tariff makes companies do unnatural things in terms of how they bring their products to market. So as everyone's probably noticed, you can't buy books in the Kindle app on the iPhone.
Right.
You're routed to Safari for that experience. Why? Because Amazon will not pay Apple 30% of its Kindle book revenue for the privilege of selling it within the native app. It degrades the customer experience, not painfully, but in a way that's weird. There's other examples of companies behaving weirdly because they cannot afford to not be on Apple's ecosystem, but they also can't afford to pay the gatekeeper to the degree that they need to participate. There's categories of apps that don't show up on the App Store at all, in compilers and developing programs for the phone. These are not the only areas of concern, and I think the free speech concerns, or more concerns at the moment, things like INS and CBP and Department of Homeland Security getting into people's Telegram chats to spy on protesters in Oregon. Again, we're not going to make this a political podcast, but that's a huge concern. How Apple runs the App Store may be less of a concern, but it doesn't mean that it should be ignored. Did I even come close to answering your question?
You did. Okay. I don't know that this is something we want to get into today, but it would be interesting. I get what you're saying about the 30%. At the same time, I do think about things. Tim Cook talked about this during the hearings, although somebody had mentioned it. I keep thinking it was Harry McCracken. I don't remember who it was. It might have been somebody else. Could have been Phil Schiller, and somebody else just retweeted it. But it used to cost, the commission used to be between 50% and 70% for stuff that you were putting onto a phone, and there was no guarantee that it would be, there was no transparency. You can argue about whether there's transparency about how things are approved now, but there was no transparency before the App Store. At least you have a set of rules now. And if you think you didn't violate the rules, and Apple thinks you did violate the rules, you're still kind of SOL, although Apple did say at WWDC that they were going to go ahead and come up with a way that people would be able to argue with or challenge the rules, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand 30% seems onerous now, but 30% is significantly lower than what it used to be. And I do wonder at what point we just have to say that is the cost of doing business. Because It's the cost of doing business. I don't understand. Like Spotify thinks that Apple has a monopoly. Spotify, which just topped 300 million users, and I want to say 138 million paid, I believe is what they said last week, because they just reported numbers last week. And Spotify will come and say that Apple is being anti-competitive. Apple doesn't even have, I think, a third of their users. And so I'm not saying that Spotify is wrong. I know it's much more complex than I realize, but for everybody to now say, well, 30% is just, I mean, it's abhorrent, it's impossible. I mean, I'm thinking about all the people whose businesses have suddenly taken a huge hit. They don't get to just go, well, that's no fair, I shouldn't have to pay this much. I mean, they're in like really difficult times right now. But before they started, they had to figure out, okay, here's how much it's going to cost us to do business. Here's how much that we think we're going to make. Here's how we're going to do our business plan. There seems to be this idea that, well, I have an idea for an app, and so I should get all the money from that app, no matter what it runs on, no matter whose store it goes into. And then, of course, Cook also pointed out, that Google, I think, also gets 30%. Other places get 30%. I mean, it's become sort of the standard, which you could argue is because of Apple.
Yeah.
I'm confused by the 30% is onerous, because I wish it cost me less to do everything that I do. But
It's true.
but I can't just turn to one person and go, well, it should cost less, so make it cost less, which people can do with, or try to do with, Apple.
Well, they try to do it with Apple, but I think the point is that in a lot of areas, like for example, your example of I wish it could cost less. Well, if you work with, Bluehost and you want to or Libsyn, and they say, well, we're raising prices, you have an option, which is you can change the partner that you're working with, you can change the vendor you're working with. Where people talk about anti-competitive behavior is one party sets the rules, and there is no competition. There is no alternative app store. There's no way, like, other than doing web apps or doing these workarounds. There's no other way to do it. So this goes back to the inception of the App Store, that a gated community, a walled garden for app sales is fine, as long as there is meaningful competition. And in Apple's case, that would be Android or other platforms. You continually have to look at that and say, is that competition still meaningful? An example from a different universe, different part of the technology landscape. Slack has lodged a complaint, I believe, in the EU against Microsoft because of Microsoft Teams. And it's not because people can't go find Slack or can't use Slack on their PCs. It's because Microsoft, by making Teams launch automatically on every Windows 10 install, every time you reboot the machine, Microsoft Teams comes up, which it's actually hard to get it to stop. I've tried. By creating the perception that a third-party product is unnecessary because something is built into Windows, Microsoft is abusing its monopoly power, or its power as the OS vendor, to inappropriately bundle a secondary app, in this case Teams, which is the collaboration app. If that is anti-competitive, or at least Slack is saying it is, you look at the spectrum of Apple's behavior and you say, well, I don't see anything that looks quite like that, except Apple's continuously Sherlocking third-party developers by rolling their features into iOS or macOS. Apple has built a very successful walled garden, $13 billion services business, where you can argue that there's no way around it. Now, Spotify saying Apple's monopolistic is a lot closer to what Slack is saying about Teams. It's not that you don't have optionality. It's that by presenting the default, provider for music as a fait accompli to that user, or to the new user of the phone, Apple is saying, well, you don't need to think about Spotify because we got you covered. When in fact there may be differentiation. There may be things that Spotify does better than Apple Music, but most people will never find out. Again, they might say, if they were making the parallel argument to Slack, because Apple's already sort of covered it. So maybe what they want is Apple to, when you turn on your new phone, the way it used to happen on Windows, you had to pick your search engine or you had to pick your browser
Right.
from a list that was randomized. Like it wasn't always Internet Explorer in the top or Bing at the top, because the power of incumbency, the power of owning that platform real estate is so overwhelming in terms of consumer choice. So many of them will never consider something else because the default as presented is good enough. There's a lot of different examples, but that's one.
That is interesting because you hear that like HomePod is going to let you set Spotify, Tidal, something else as the default music player for HomePod, but there is still the issue of you have to go in and set it, as opposed
Right.
to it saying, do you want to do this? Do you want to do, do you want to do the other? All right, you giving me stuff to think about, you jerk.
Sorry.